She was 20 months old and she simply vanished in the night. And for more than a decade, the one person who was supposed to protect her has never been charged with a single crime. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from right now. And if stories like this one stay with you long after the screen goes dark, subscribe to Missing Case Network, because tomorrow we uncover another case that will change the way you think about the people we trust most. There are numbers in this story that will stay with you. 8. It is such a small number. 8 pounds, 3 ounces. The weight of Ayla Bell Reynolds when she entered the world on April 4th, 2010, in Waterville, Maine. 8 is the number of hours that passed, according to her father, between the last time he saw her alive and the moment he called 911. 8 is how many months her case sat before investigators publicly named persons of interest. And 8, the age she would have been had she lived, is the number that hangs over everything in this story like a question that has never been answered. She never made it to 8. To understand what happened to Ayla Reynolds, you have to understand the world she was born into. Not a cruel world, not an unusual one, just a fractured one, the kind that exists in mill towns and small cities all across the American Northeast, where the economy has been retreating for decades and the people left behind are doing their best with what they have. Waterville, Maine, sits in Kennebec County, about an hour north of Portland. It is a city of roughly 15,000 people, at a place where everybody tends to know everybody, where the same family names appear in the high school yearbook across 3 generations, and where the local news still covers Little League championships and church bingo nights with the same weight it gives to everything else. Ayla's mother was Trista Reynolds. She was 23 years old at the time of Ayla's birth, young and struggling, but devoted to her daughter from the first moment she held her. Trista had grown up in the Waterville area. She knew hard times. She had navigated a life that hadn't offered her many easy roads, but Ayla, from the very beginning, was the thing that made all of it matter. Friends and family who knew Trista then described the way she was with her daughter. The fierce protectiveness of a young mother who understood exactly how precious and fragile the small life she was responsible for truly was. Ayla's father was Justin DiPietro. He was 24 years old at the time of Ayla's birth, a young man from a family with deeper roots and more financial stability than Trista's. Justin and Trista had not been in a relationship for long, and by the time Ayla arrived, the romantic connection between them was already unraveling. What remained was what always remains in those situations: a child who needed both of her parents and 2 young people trying to figure out what that meant. For much of Ayla's first year and into her second, the arrangement between Justin and Trista was informal and frequently tense. And Ayla spent time with both parents. She grew the way small children grow, fast and in bursts, each week bringing something new. She learned to walk. She learned to recognize faces and laugh at things that struck her as funny. She developed preferences, favorite foods, a stuffed animal she was particularly attached to, small rituals that toddlers build around themselves like invisible architecture. By the fall of 2011, Ayla had a broken left arm. She had injured it sometime in the preceding weeks. The precise circumstances of how a 20-month-old child sustained a fracture were not entirely clear, and this detail would become significant later. What is known is that the arm had been set and placed in a cast, and that Ayla was still wearing that cast at the time of her disappearance. In November of 2011, Trista Reynolds entered a rehabilitation program. It was a voluntary decision, a sign, her supporters would later argue, of exactly the kind of responsible parenting instinct that her detractors would try to deny her. She was working on herself. She wanted to be better for Ayla. While she was in the program, Justin DiPietro stepped in to take primary care of their daughter. Child welfare authorities were involved peripherally at that time. There had been some contact with the Department of Health and Human Services regarding the family, but Ayla was placed in Justin's care formally, and for the last several weeks of her life, she lived in his house. Justin DiPietro lived on Violet Avenue in Waterville with his mother, Phoebe DiPietro, and his sister, Alicia DiPietro. The house was a modest, 2-story home in a residential neighborhood. By all outward appearances, it was a stable domestic environment. A grandmother, a father, an aunt, all under one roof with a toddler, 3 adults and one small child. On the evening of Friday, December 16, 2011, Ayla Reynolds was alive. Justin DiPietro would later tell investigators that he put his daughter to bed that night at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. He said she was healthy, that she had eaten, that there was nothing unusual about the night. He said he checked on her before he himself went to sleep. The next morning, Saturday, December 17, 2011, Justin DiPietro called 911. Ayla was gone. The call came in at approximately 8:54 in the morning. Justin DiPietro told the dispatcher that he had gone to check on his daughter and found her crib empty. He said he had searched the house. He said she was not there. The dispatcher, responding to what was described as a missing toddler report, sent officers from the Waterville Police Department to Violet Avenue immediately. What the responding officers found when they arrived was a quiet house, 3 adults who appeared calm, and no sign of a 20-month-old child. There was no indication of a break-in. The doors had been locked. The windows were intact. The temperature outside was in the low 20s. A brutal December cold that made the idea of a toddler wandering outside on her own not merely improbable, but essentially incompatible with survival. In the first hours of the investigation, police treated the situation as a potential abduction, which is the protocol for a missing child when the circumstances don't point clearly in any other direction. The FBI was notified. A command post was established. Search teams were mobilized. Within a day, what had begun as a local missing child report had expanded into a major multi-agency investigation involving the Maine State Police, the FBI, and the Maine Warden Service. The search that followed was one of the largest in Maine history. Hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement personnel in combing the areas around Waterville. Fields, riverbanks, frozen ponds, wooded lots, anywhere a small child might conceivably have gone or might conceivably have been taken. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Helicopters swept the terrain from above. Divers were sent into the cold waters of the Kennebec River. None of it produced Ayla. And what it produced instead was something more ambiguous, a growing sense among the investigators who were simultaneously running a criminal investigation alongside the physical search that the story Justin DiPietro was telling them didn't fit the physical evidence of his own home. Inside the DiPietro house on Violet Avenue, forensic teams began processing the scene with the kind of thoroughness that missing child cases demand. What they found, or rather what Maine State Police would reveal in carefully measured increments over the weeks and months that followed, began to reframe the disappearance entirely. There was blood in the house, not a trace amount, a significant quantity of blood, consistent with a serious injury. And the blood, forensic analysts determined, belonged to Ayla Reynolds, a 20-month-old child, last seen alive in a locked house. Her blood, found in multiple locations inside that house, had vanished without a trace. No forced entry, no credible sightings, no ransom demand, no tip, however unlikely, that placed Ayla somewhere alive. The investigation had barely begun, and already the silence around it was becoming its own form of answer. The call that Trista Reynolds received on the morning of December 17, 2011, is the kind of call that human beings are not built to absorb. She was still in her rehabilitation program. Someone called her, and the words they used to deliver the information were probably careful and measured, because no one wants to be the person who breaks that particular news carelessly. But no amount of carefulness changes what those words mean. Her daughter, gone, from Justin's house, no one knows where. What followed for Trista Reynolds over the coming days, weeks, months, and ultimately years is a story that runs in parallel to the official investigation, sometimes intersecting with it, sometimes running at cross purposes to it, always defined by the unbearable arithmetic of a mother who knows her child is gone and cannot get anyone to tell her the truth about what happened. Trista left the rehabilitation program immediately. There was no question of staying. She returned to Waterville and threw herself into what she knew best, loving her daughter out loud, in public, refusing to let the world move on without Ayla. She gave interviews. She held vigils. She worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She spoke to reporters with a directness that sometimes surprised people. Not the careful, measured grief that public cases often produce, but something rawer, angrier, more honest. Trista Reynolds believed, from very early on, that Ayla was not missing in any conventional sense. She believed that the people in that house on Violet Avenue knew what had happened to her daughter. She said so publicly. She said it repeatedly. She named Justin DiPietro not as a grieving father cooperating with police, but as a person who was not telling the truth. This put her at odds with some of the conventions of how such cases are publicly managed. Investigators, bound by the constraints of building a prosecutable case, could not say what Trista was saying. The media, sensitive to liability, hedged. The public, encountering the story in fragments, was left to form their own impressions. But Trista kept talking. For years, she kept talking. And because talking was the only tool she had. Maine State Police, for their part, were careful in what they disclosed. They confirmed the blood evidence. They confirmed that investigators did not believe Ayla's disappearance was consistent with an abduction by a stranger. They confirmed that the three adults in the house, Justin DiPietro, his mother Phoebe, and his sister Elisha, were persons of interest. What they did not do for a very long time was arrest anyone. Justin DiPietro was not a man with a long criminal history. He did not have a documented record of violence, no prior arrests that painted a picture of someone with a pattern of dangerous behavior. He was, by most surface accounts, a young man who had grown up in Waterville, who worked, who had a family, who moved through the world without attracting particular attention. But in the weeks after Ayla's disappearance, as reporters and investigators alike began to look more closely at the details of his life in the months before December 16th, certain things came into focus. Justin DiPietro had taken out a life insurance policy on Ayla Reynolds. The policy, in the amount of $25,000, had been purchased in October 2011, approximately 2 months before Ayla disappeared. Ayla was a 20-month-old toddler. The existence of a life insurance policy on a child that age is not, on its own, extraordinary. Parents do it as a financial planning measure all the time. But the timing of this particular policy, taken out 2 months before Ayla's disappearance, with Justin named as the beneficiary, was a detail that investigators noted carefully and that would remain part of the public conversation around the case for years. After Ayla disappeared, Justin DiPietro and his family gave a series of public interviews that drew significant scrutiny from both investigators and the public. The interviews were stilted in ways that were hard to define but impossible to ignore. A flatness of affect, a certain quality of rehearsed grief, responses that circled the central questions without quite landing on them. In one nationally televised appearance, Justin sat beside his mother. He spoke about Ayla in terms that people who loved the child found inadequate. He expressed hope that she would be found. He pleaded in the formulaic language of missing child cases, for whoever had taken her to bring her home safely. But he did not cooperate with police in the ways that investigators said they needed him to cooperate. He stopped giving formal interviews to law enforcement relatively quickly. His attorney, whom he retained early in the investigation, became the primary buffer between Justin and the questions that investigators were pressing. In Maine, as in most American states, a person of interest has the absolute right to decline to speak with law enforcement without an attorney present and to instruct their attorney to limit that communication. Justin DiPietro exercised that right. Trista Reynolds watched all of this and said what she believed plainly. He knows what happened to my daughter. There is a detail in this case that deserves its own extended consideration, because it speaks to something that happened to Ayla Reynolds before the night of December 16th. Something that raises questions about what kind of life she was living in the weeks before she disappeared. The broken arm. Ayla had sustained a fracture of her left arm sometime in the fall of 2011, while in Justin DiPietro's care. The injury had been treated medically. She was taken to the hospital, the arm was set, she was placed in a cast. The medical records of this visit exist. What is notable is not the injury itself. Children fall, children sustain fractures, and a broken arm in a toddler is not automatically a sign of abuse. What is notable is the pattern of contact that the Maine Department of Health and Human Services had with this family during the period leading up to Ayla's disappearance, and what that pattern does or does not tell us about the environment in which Ayla was living. Child welfare agencies across the country operate under what advocates call a reunification bias. a structural preference built into the policies and funding mechanisms of the child welfare system for keeping families together and returning children to biological parents whenever possible. This bias is not without its merits. The data on the long-term outcomes of children who enter the foster care system is complicated and often troubling, and researchers have documented real harms that can flow from unnecessary family separation. But the bias also means that warning signs are sometimes minimized, that injuries are sometimes attributed to innocent causes without sufficient scrutiny, and that children remain in homes that are not safe for them. This is not a failure unique to Maine. It is a systemic pattern documented in states across the country, and it has contributed to child deaths in case after case after case. Whether it contributed to Ayla's death is something investigators believe they knew. What they had difficulty proving in a courtroom beyond a reasonable doubt was a different matter. What we know is this: a 20-month-old child with a broken arm in the care of a father who would shortly be named as a person of interest in her death was visited by or known to child welfare authorities. She was not removed from the home. She remained on Violette Avenue. And on December 16, 2011, she went to sleep and she never woke up, and she has never been found. In the years that followed the initial press conference, the investigation into Ayla's disappearance became one of the most closely watched cold cases in New England. Maine is a small state. The circles of people who know each other, who share information, who have opinions about what happened and who is responsible, are tight and overlapping. In Waterville specifically, where the DiPietro family was known, and where Trista Reynolds was known, and where the case had played out in real time in the local newspaper and on the local evening news, it was impossible to go very long without encountering someone with a connection to the story. Maine State Police maintained that the investigation was active and ongoing. They periodically confirmed that they were still pursuing the case. They declined, consistently and year after year, not to provide detailed updates about the state of the evidence or the status of any potential prosecution. What leaked out over time came primarily from two sources: investigative journalists, particularly those at the Portland Press-Herald, and other regional outlets who stayed on the story when the national media had moved on, and Trista Reynolds herself, who remained in constant contact with investigators and with the public. Trista had become, by this point, something more than a grieving mother. She was an advocate, a spokesperson for her daughter's memory, a person who had educated herself deeply on the forensic and legal dimensions of the case, and who was willing to talk about those dimensions publicly in ways that most families in her position, advised by attorneys to stay quiet, would not have done. She ran a Facebook page dedicated to Ayla. She gave interviews. She appeared at events connected to child safety and missing child advocacy. She never stopped. What she wanted and what she told anyone who would listen that she needed was simple. She wanted justice for Ayla. She wanted someone charged. She wanted someone to stand in front of a judge and a jury and answer for what had happened in that house on Violette Avenue. It did not come. Year after year, it did not come. Meanwhile, Justin DiPietro largely retreated from public view. He moved away from Waterville. He built a life in the way that people build lives that did not have his daughter's disappearance at the center of it. He was not in prison. He was not charged. He was, as far as the legal system was concerned, a person of interest in an open investigation, which meant that he was legally free. Investigators searched the Kennebec River multiple times in the years following Ayla's disappearance. The Kennebec is a significant river. It runs through the heart of central Maine, through Augusta and Waterville, southward toward the coast. In winter, sections of it freeze. In spring, the ice breaks and the current runs fast and cold. It is the kind of river that keeps its secrets. The searches of the Kennebec were never publicly described as resulting in the discovery of Ayla's remains. They produced nothing that investigators disclosed publicly. The river and the lakes and ponds and frozen terrain of Kennebec County absorbed the searches and gave nothing back. This is the aspect of the case that haunts people who follow it most deeply. Ayla Reynolds is almost certainly dead. The blood evidence in the house, the behavior of the adults present that night, the absence of any credible sighting in the years since, all of it points toward a terrible conclusion. But without a body, without the physical remains of this child, There is a wound in the case that will not close. Trista Reynolds has spoken about what this means for her. Not knowing where Ayla is, not being able to go to a place, a grave, a marker, some point in the physical world where her daughter exists, is its own form of cruelty. Families of missing persons have long described this condition, the absence of what grief counselors sometimes call closure. Though that word is inadequate for what they mean. What they mean is, I cannot mourn fully because I do not have the thing to mourn over. I cannot say goodbye because there is no place to say it. The loss exists in a permanent subjunctive. My daughter might be gone. My daughter is probably gone. My daughter was taken from me. But the past tense, the definitive finality, is withheld. This is what Justin DiPietro, if he knows what happened to Ayla, has denied Trista Reynolds. Not only Ayla's life, not only justice, but the basic human dignity of being allowed to grieve completely. In June of 2012, approximately 6 months after Ayla's disappearance, Maine State Police held a press conference that fundamentally changed the public understanding of the case. Steve McCausland, the spokesman for the Maine Department of Public Safety, stood before cameras and confirmed what many had already suspected. Investigators believed that Ayla Reynolds was dead, and they believed that the 3 adults who had been in the house on Violette Avenue on the night she disappeared were responsible. The language was careful. It had to be, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was no longer a missing child case. This was a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation in which the investigators were confident they knew who was responsible, but in which they had not yet made an arrest. McCausland also confirmed what had been reported in fragments. Ayla's blood had been found in the residence. The amount was, in the language of the official statement, more than you would expect to find from a minor injury. It was found in multiple locations in the house, including in the basement. The forensic picture was one of a serious and likely fatal injury to a small child. And the investigators said something else at that press conference, something that landed with particular force. They believed that Justin DiPietro, Phoebe DiPietro, and Elisha DiPietro were all present in the house on the night Ayla disappeared, and that all 3 had more knowledge of what had happened than they were sharing. 3 adults, 1 child, 1 night. And a wall of silence that would hold for years. The case against Justin DiPietro and the other 2 adults was, investigators acknowledged, complicated by the absence of a body. Maine law, like the law of most states, permits prosecution for homicide without a body. The legal principle, established through decades of case law, is that corpus delicti, the requirement to establish that a crime occurred, can be satisfied through other forms of evidence. Blood evidence sufficient in quantity to suggest a fatal injury. The absence of any credible alternative explanation. The behavior of the suspects in the aftermath. But in practice, building a case without a body means building a case on inference and circumstantial evidence, and prosecutors are acutely aware of the difficulty of securing a conviction on those foundations alone. The Kennebec County District Attorney's Office, reviewing the evidence that investigators brought to them, made the assessment that the case was not yet strong enough to bring to a jury with confidence. It was a decision that Trista Reynolds found devastating. It was a decision that would define the next decade of her life. Let us spend some time with what is actually known, because in a case built so heavily on inference and official silence, it is important to be precise about the distinction between what is established and what is theorized. Ayla Reynolds was last confirmed alive on the evening of December the 16th, 2011, when Justin DiPietro reported putting her to bed at approximately 9 o'clock. Ayla was reported missing the following morning by Justin DiPietro. There was no sign of forced entry or external intrusion at the Violette Avenue residence. A significant quantity of blood belonging to Ayla Reynolds was found inside the residence, in multiple locations including the basement. Maine State Police publicly stated that they do not believe Ayla's disappearance was the result of a stranger abduction. Maine State Police publicly named Justin DiPietro, Phoebe DiPietro, and Elisha DiPietro as persons of interest and stated publicly that they believe all 3 were present in the home on the night of the disappearance and have more knowledge of what occurred than they have disclosed. Justin DiPietro had taken out a life insurance policy on Ayla approximately 2 months before her disappearance. Ayla had sustained a broken arm while in Justin DiPietro's care in the weeks before her disappearance. No body has been recovered. No charges have been filed. What this tells us, when laid out plainly, is both more and less than people want it to be. It is more in the sense that the preponderance of this evidence points clearly toward a conclusion that the adults in that house are responsible for Ayla's death. It is less in the sense that a preponderance is not a certainty, and more critically, it is not the legal standard required for a criminal conviction. The theory that investigators have publicly gestured toward, without ever stating it as directly as Trista Reynolds has, is that Ayla Reynolds suffered a fatal injury in the DiPietro home on the night of December 16, 2011, that the three adults in the house concealed that injury and concealed her death, that they disposed of her body in a manner that has prevented its recovery, and that they subsequently told a story to law enforcement that was false in its essential particulars. No one has been charged with any crime connected to this theory. The investigation remains officially open. There is a broader question that Ayla's case forces, and it is a question that her story shares with a distressing number of other cases involving children who died or disappeared in the care of parents or guardians. The question is this: at what point did the people whose job it was to protect Ayla Reynolds fail to do so? This is not a rhetorical question designed to assign blame retrospectively. It is a genuine inquiry into the mechanics of how systems that are supposed to protect children sometimes do not, and what the consequences of those failures are. The Maine Department of Health and Human Services had contact with the family. The specific nature and depth of that contact is not fully in the public record, but it is known that DHHS was aware of the family situation, the arrangement between Trista and Justin, on the fact that a very young child was in the care of a relatively young father who was new to that primary caretaker role, the broken arm. In the aftermath of Ayla's disappearance, there was considerable discussion in Maine, in the legislature, in the press, among child welfare advocates, about whether the system had missed warning signs it should have caught, whether the caseworkers involved had followed proper procedures, whether the procedures themselves were adequate. A review was conducted, reports were issued. The language of those reports, as is often the case with institutional self-examination, was careful and measured in ways that frustrated people who were looking for accountability. What did not emerge from those reviews was a clear, unambiguous statement that a particular decision made by a particular person where it had placed Ayla in danger that could have been avoided. The systemic failures, to the extent they existed, were diffuse, distributed across policies and protocols and individual judgment calls that, taken together, produced an outcome that no single actor was responsible for in an easily definable way. Trista Reynolds found all of this inadequate. She still finds it inadequate. Her position has been consistent. A child died, and the people responsible for that child's death have not been held accountable, and the system that was supposed to protect that child did not protect her, and none of that is acceptable. She is not wrong. The case entered what investigators call a long cold phase, and what Trista Reynolds called simply the waiting. 2012 passed without charges, 2013, 2014. Each year brought a handful of news cycles, the anniversary of the disappearance, the release of some new piece of information or renewed appeal from law enforcement, an interview with Trista, and each year the essential situation remained unchanged. People who follow cold cases know this rhythm intimately. There is a quality to an investigation in this phase that is difficult to describe. Not truly stalled, because investigators will tell you they are always working, always following leads, always reviewing evidence, but also not moving, not visibly, not in the ways that matter to the people most directly affected. What changes during these years sometimes is the science. Forensic technology has advanced with extraordinary speed in the last 2 decades. Our DNA analysis that was impossible in 1990 was routine by 2010 and sophisticated beyond what even specialists could have predicted by 2020. The field of forensic genealogy, using publicly available genetic databases to construct family trees from unknown DNA, has opened cases that had been cold for 30, 40 years. Luminol and other blood detection reagents have become more sensitive. Digital forensics have expanded the evidentiary footprint of any crime that touches modern technology. Whether any of these advances could change the outcome of the Ayla Reynolds investigation is not something investigators have publicly addressed. What they have continued to maintain is that the case is active, that new information is always welcome, and that they believe they know what happened. They are waiting, as investigators in cases like this sometimes wait, for the moment when the evidence crosses the threshold that transforms belief into proof. Justin DiPietro, Phoebe DiPietro, Alicia DiPietro. Three people who have been publicly identified by Maine State Police as persons of interest in the disappearance of Ayla Reynolds. Three people who were in the house on Violette Avenue on the night she vanished. Three people who have not been charged with any crime. It is worth considering in a case built so significantly on official silence what the official designation of person of interest actually means. It is not an accusation. It is not a charge. It is not a finding of any kind. It is an investigative label that means, essentially, we believe this person has information relevant to what we are investigating. It is applied carefully in cases where investigators want to signal to the public and to the person so designated that they are under scrutiny without creating legal exposure that could complicate a future prosecution. Justin DiPietro has maintained through his attorney and in his limited public statements that he did not harm his daughter and does not know what happened to her. He has said that he loved Ayla. He has expressed, in the language of a father confronted with loss, his grief at her absence. He has not, to the knowledge of investigators, provided any information that would help locate Ayla's remains. Phoebe DiPietro and Alicia DiPietro have been similarly silent in the years since the investigation began. They too have not been charged. They too remain persons of interest. When what passed between those three people on the night of December the 16th and the morning of December 17th, 2011, is known only to them. The walls of that house on Violette Avenue absorbed what happened, and the people who were inside have chosen or been advised to keep it there. Waterville is not a large city. The disappearance of Ayla Reynolds was not merely a news story there. It was a rupture. A small child was gone, and many people in the community believed, with a conviction born of proximity and familiarity, that they knew who was responsible. The community organized searches in the early days after the disappearance. They raised money for the reward fund, originally set at $30,000, later increased, for information leading to the location of Ayla's remains. And they held vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance. They wore pink, which had been associated with Ayla's memory, and they put her photo in their windows, and they posted on social media, and they did the things that communities do when they refuse to let a child be forgotten. Some of this attention was uncomfortable for the people it was directed at. Justin DiPietro reportedly experienced significant hostility in Waterville in the months after Ayla's disappearance. Not from law enforcement, who were constrained by the rules of their investigation, but from ordinary citizens who had formed their own conclusions. This hostility and the desire to escape it is cited by some observers as part of the reason he eventually left the area. The departure of Justin DiPietro from Waterville did not resolve anything. It did not bring Ayla home. It did not produce a confession. It did not result in an arrest. It simply meant that the source of the community's anger was no longer visible to them daily. What remained was Trista Reynolds and the vigils and the pink and the faces of people who knew this child and could not let her go. As of the time of this recording, a reward remains available for information leading to the location of Ayla Reynolds' remains. The existence of a reward, in a case like this, is both a practical investigative tool and a statement about the nature of the situation. It is an acknowledgement that whatever happened in that house on Violette Avenue, there is a possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, that someone outside the immediate circle of the three persons of interest knows something. A neighbor, a friend, a person who was told something in confidence, someone who has been carrying a piece of information for years without understanding its significance. In cold cases, the break often comes from exactly this kind of source. Not from new forensic technology, though that matters. Not from investigators uncovering a previously overlooked piece of evidence, though that happens too. It often comes from a person who has been silent and who at some point for reasons of conscience or fear or changed circumstances or the simple passage of time, decides not to be silent anymore. People who follow the Ayla Reynolds case hold on to this possibility. They hold on to it because the alternative, that three people harmed a child and concealed that harm and have faced no consequences and will face no consequences, is something the mind resists accepting. Not because justice is guaranteed. History shows that it is not, but because the scale of the wrong demands some kind of reckoning. Trista Reynolds has said versions of this for years. She has said that she believes someone who knows something will eventually come forward. She has said that she has not given up. She has said, in the particular language of a mother who has made her grief into a kind of activism, that Ayla's story is not finished. Let us sit with this for a moment. 3 adults, 1 night, 1 small child, and a silence that has now lasted more than a decade. What does it take to maintain that kind of silence? And this is not a rhetorical question. It is in some ways the central psychological question of the case, because the conventional understanding of how people behave in the aftermath of a terrible thing is that silence is hard to sustain. That guilt eats at people, that the weight of what you know eventually overwhelms the reasons for keeping it. And yet, Justin DiPietro has not confessed. Phoebe DiPietro has not confessed. Elisha DiPietro has not confessed. As far as the public record shows, none of them has provided investigators with any meaningful information about what happened to Ayla. There are several ways to think about how this is possible. The first is purely legal. Anyone facing potential criminal prosecution is almost certainly advised by their attorney not to speak to investigators. And that advice is legally and ethically sound regardless of guilt or innocence. The right to remain silent is not a guilty person's tool. It is a constitutional protection that exists precisely because the risk of self-incrimination is real and the consequences of a criminal conviction are severe. Justin DiPietro, whatever he knows or doesn't know, has the right to say nothing, and exercising that right is not evidence of guilt. The second is psychological. People are extraordinarily capable of self-protective rationalization. The human mind has a documented capacity to reframe events, to minimize responsibility, to construct narratives that allow a person to live with actions they could not otherwise tolerate. A person who has done something terrible in the immediate chaotic aftermath of that act, may construct an internal story about it that makes silence feel not just self-serving, but genuinely justified. The third is familial. The 3 persons of interest are a father, a mother, and a daughter. 2 of them are parent and child. The bonds that hold families together, even families fractured by terrible events, are some of the strongest forces in human social life. There are cases, many cases, in which family members have covered for each other in the aftermath of crimes that their own conscience found reprehensible, not because they approved of what happened, but because the alternative, watching someone they love be prosecuted and imprisoned, felt worse than the silence. None of these frameworks is exculpatory. None of them changes what happened to Ayla Reynolds. But they are part of the answer to how a silence that has lasted more than a decade remains intact. In April of 2030, Ayla Bell Reynolds would have turned 20 years old. She would have been, in another world, a young woman. She would have been in college, perhaps, or beginning a career, or figuring out who she was in the way that young people in their late teens and early 20s do. Messily, with wrong turns, with the particular combination of confidence and confusion that characterizes that time of life. She would have had opinions about music and food and the people she spent her time with. She would have had dreams, the kind that form slowly and then suddenly, that feel too large for the life you're living and then, one day, become the life itself. She would have had a mother who loved her with an intensity that had survived years of impossible grief. None of that happened. None of that will happen. What we have instead is the photograph, the one that became the public face of this case, reproduced thousands of times in news articles and Facebook posts and reward flyers. Ayla as she was in the fall of 2011, not quite 2 years old, with wide dark eyes and a small nose, and the particular unself-conscious expression of a toddler who has not yet learned to pose for cameras. She is wearing a cast on her left arm in some of the photos. She looks like a child who is loved. She looks like a child who trusts the world. The cast on her arm is the detail that stops people. She was hurt, and then she was gone, and the people who hurt her have not answered for it. One of Trista Reynolds has not been passive. In the years since Ayla's disappearance, she has worked with advocacy groups, with law enforcement, with journalists, and with the public to keep the case alive and to put pressure on the system that she believes has failed her daughter twice, once by not protecting her and once by not prosecuting the people responsible for her death. She has been asked many times what she knows or believes she knows about what happened. She has been careful in the way that people who have consulted attorneys are careful, not to say things that could complicate the investigation or give anyone a legal foothold to challenge what she says. But she has been consistent in the broad strokes of her belief. Ayla died in that house. The people who were with her know what happened. While the absence of her remains is the result of a deliberate effort to prevent that knowledge from being proved. She has also been honest about what the years of waiting have cost her. Grief that cannot complete itself, that has no endpoint, no body to bury, no verdict to absorb and accept, does something particular to a person. It does not go away. It reshapes itself, changes form, becomes something that lives alongside ordinary life rather than disrupting it, but it never fully integrates. There is always a space where the resolution should be, and it remains empty. What has sustained Trista Reynolds, by her own account, is the refusal to accept that the empty space is permanent. She has continued to believe year after year that the case will break, that someone will talk, that the evidence or the technology or the passage of time will eventually produce the outcome that the blood in the basement and the silence of 3 adults has been prevented from producing so far. She is still waiting. In a case this unresolved, with this much public attention and this many years to contemplate, theories multiply. The internet has not been kind to this case, or rather the internet has been the internet, which means that speculation has sometimes outpaced evidence, that accusations have sometimes been made without adequate basis, and that the actual investigation has sometimes been obscured by the noise of amateur analysis. What follows are theories, presented here as theories, not as established facts. One theory, perhaps the most widely held, is that Ayla Reynolds died as the result of a deliberate act of violence on the night of December 16th, when that the act was witnessed by or known to all 3 adults in the house, and that the 3 adults collectively decided to conceal what had happened and dispose of her remains. A second theory, which investigators have gestured toward without confirming, is that the death may have resulted from an injury that, while ultimately fatal, was not necessarily premeditated. That something happened in the course of that night, an act of violence that went further than intended, and that the response was to cover it rather than to call for help. These are theories. They are informed by the available evidence, but they are not the findings of a court, and they should not be treated as such. What can be said without qualification is that a child is gone, that her blood was found in the place she was supposed to be safe, and that the people who were with her that night have provided no explanation that investigators have found credible or sufficient. Cases involving children who disappear or die at the hands of those who were supposed to love them are among the hardest cases for the public to sit with. They challenge something fundamental, the assumption, which most people carry without quite being aware of it, that children are safe in the arms of their parents, that the home is a sanctuary, that the adults who created a life are bound by that act of creation to protect it. Most of the time, that assumption is correct. Most parents, in most circumstances, are exactly what they appear to be: imperfect, overwhelmed, sometimes frightened, but genuinely committed to the survival and flourishing of their children. The parent who would harm a child is the exception, not the rule. But the exception exists, and when it is encountered, in a news story, in a case file, in the weight of a child's blood on a basement floor, it generates a kind of vertigo. How do we live in a world where this happens? How do we hold the knowledge that a 20-month-old child with a broken arm went to sleep in a house where she was supposed to be cared for and woke up in whatever darkness came after and has never come home? There is no satisfying answer to this. What there is instead is Trista Reynolds, still talking, still fighting, still insisting that her daughter's story is not finished. still holding the space open for the justice that has not yet come. She is doing what she can do. In the absence of everything she cannot have, her daughter, an arrest, a conviction, a grave to visit, she is doing what she can do. She is not letting Ayla be forgotten. Before we go, I want to say her name one more time. Ayla Bell Reynolds, born April 4th, 2010, in Waterville, Maine. 20 months old at the time of her disappearance. Wide dark eyes, a pink cast on her left arm, a stuffed animal she was attached to, a mother who loved her so fiercely that love became the engine of a decade-long campaign for justice. She weighed 8 pounds, 3 ounces when she came into the world. She had been alive for less than 2 years when she left it. She never made it to 8 years old. If you have any information about the disappearance of Ayla Reynolds, any information at all, however small, however uncertain, however long ago you came by it, Maine State Police are still actively accepting tips. If Trista Reynolds is still asking, the reward is still available. And somewhere, in whatever form she takes now, Ayla Reynolds is still waiting to be found. Cases like this one exist in the space between what we know and what we can prove. They live in the silence of people who have chosen, for reasons of self-protection or family loyalty or simple fear, not to speak. They are sustained by the mothers who refuse to stop asking, and the investigators who refuse to stop looking, and the communities that refuse to let the name fade. They end, when they end, because someone, somewhere, finally decides that the silence has cost too much. We are still waiting for that moment in Ayla's case. Until it comes, her story remains open. Her name remains Ayla, and we will not forget her. Thanks for being here and for listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care of the ones you love.